Are you afraid, or are you a fraud? That is the question we are diving into today here on episode number 236 of the In a Weekend podcast. Today I'm going to share where the idea for this episode came from, and I'm going to be sharing a personal story and peeling back the curtain on an experience that I had that you might be able to relate to. Plus, I'm going to give you 3 actionable tips that can help you decide whether you're feeling afraid or if you're feeling like a fraud. Are you ready to dive in? Your heart is racing. Your mouth gets dry. Your hands, they shake uncontrollably, and all you want to do is flee the scene. This, my friends, is fear. It's your fight or flight mechanism at work. It's meant to keep you safe and out of harm's way, yet sometimes fear stops us. Or, more correctly, we let fear stop us from moving forward on our big dreams. Welcome to the In a Weekend podcast. I'm your host, Yong Pratt, and this podcast is for you, my fellow dreamers, my fellow podcasters, to make your podcasting journey easier and faster than you thought possible. Before we dive in, I want to give a great big shout out to my accountability buddy and one of my biz besties, Nicole Thompson. You've met Nicole on the podcast before, and I'll be sure to link up her previous episodes on today's show notes at yongpratt.com/236. Nicole is host of the Build Your Wealth podcast and is an expert at teaching others how to start their own print-on-demand businesses. In one of our most recent weekly accountability sessions, she shared an idea for a podcast episode she was recording called Afraid or a Fraud. As soon as she said it, I immediately thought, yes! This is a topic I need to record as well because it's just so good, and it's a topic that I think a lot of people can relate to. So with Nicole's blessing, here we go. Fear. It's a 4-letter word that stops so many of us in our tracks. It consumes us. It taunts us. It often defeats us, squashing our big hopes and dreams. But I'm here to say that it doesn't have to. Have you ever thought about the reasons that you experience fear? I'm going to share a story and use myself as an example to illustrate a point. Last fall, I was challenged by Kim White, another biz bestie, to create some sort of podcasting class that took newbies from zero to podcast fast. She wanted a podcast like now, and she bluntly told me that she didn't have time and certainly was not interested in the 8-week podcasting class I had already created. She wanted something faster. Around the same time, I had another conversation with a good friend, Ann Colin, and she made the comment that it would be really cool to give families, my target audience at that time, the opportunity to experience the world of podcasting over a couple days, like a weekend. Voila, a couple of conversations with friends that knew my struggles, yet they saw my gifts and talents. And Podcast in a Weekend was born. Fast forward a little over a year now, and we've helped dozens of graduates create and launch their very own podcasts in just a weekend. Looking back, it seems kind of silly to think that I had a ton of fear when launching the class. Why? Because it turns out my fear was based on the fact that I felt like a fraud. Even though I had been podcasting since 2013, had been teaching for over 2 decades, and had systems and processes to simplify and automate my own podcast, I still felt unworthy. I let myself go to the dreaded comparison island. Now, if this is the first time you're hearing me talk about Comparison Island, don't worry, I will link up that episode in the show notes as well. Basically, I was stopping myself because I was comparing myself to the biggest names and teachers in podcasting, all of whom had been around for far longer than I had been. These are names you've likely seen in your news feed, or even if you followed any Google links in regards to podcasting or podcasting classes. I didn't have millions of downloads. I didn't have millions of followers across social media. I didn't have thousands of people on my email list. I totally felt like a fraud compared to these quote-unquote gurus. The mind chatter was non-stop, and I kept hearing questions like, who am I to be teaching podcasting? How could I possibly charge people to learn something that comes so easily to me? And who in their right mind would want to learn from me? When I say these things out loud now, I can totally hear how ridiculous they sound. The self-deprecating tone, the fear, the feeling like a fraud. As it turns out, these feelings were all in my head. During that first round of podcasts in a weekend, we graduated 8 new podcasters. And what's even more amazing than the 8 women who now had podcasts out in the world helping others was that these 8 women were a 100% success rate. By the end of the weekend, all 8 had live podcasts. These 8 women changed my life in ways I can barely put into words. They helped me own my own abilities. They helped me to validate the idea that the average person could actually create and launch a podcast in a single weekend. They led me to believe in myself, so I no longer felt like the fraud I thought I was. In the process of creating and launching, I learned it was possible to go from idea to launch in mere weeks. And in a future episode, I'll share the story with you about going from idea to launch and the fact that it only took a couple of days and not weeks and months or years. Now, what about you? Can you relate to any part of this story? I know that so many women that I talk to stop themselves from doing big things because it turns out that the fear they're facing is really a fear of them feeling unworthy. And I want this to stop. We need to stop being so hard on ourselves. We need to stop being so hard on one another and learn to support one another in this process of discovery, dreaming big, and leaning into our fears so we can get past the fear of feeling like a fraud. So before we wrap up this episode, I have 3 action steps for you to dive in today or at least in the next week. I really want you to dig into some of your fears and figure out whether they're based in you feeling like a fraud. Are you ready? Number 1, write down something that's happening in your business right now that has you feeling either afraid or maybe has you feeling like you're a fraud. Number 2, reach out to 3 friends or clients. Hop on the phone or meet face-to-face in person or with the help of some technology. Start the conversation by asking them to tell you about what they see as your special gifts and talents. Then I want you to share with them your feelings of being afraid or feeling like a fraud. Then I want you to sit back and let them lift you up and demonstrate that who you are and what you know is enough, and it has immense value to them and to the world. And number 3, come on over to yongpratt.com/236 and let me know what you have discovered from these conversations. Let's have more compassion for one another, my friends. Let's support one another, and let's help one another reach those big goals and dreams together. I cannot wait to hear from you. Stay tuned for the next episode where we're going to dive into the question, are you pod-crastinating? Yep, you heard that right. Are you procrastinating starting your podcast because maybe the timing isn't right? You haven't figured out all the things. It doesn't look perfect yet. Well, next week I'm going to share with you where I first learned this term, pod-crastinating, and diving into whether or not you, my friends, are pod-crastinating.